when Jesus was transfigured, the Bible tells us that his garments became white as the light. In other words, Adam and Eve, in their state of innocence and righteousness, were clothed with literal robes of light. But those literal robes of light were symbolic. They represented their righteousness or their obedience to God. So in the Garden of Eden, we have the literal, and we have that which the literal represents. The literal are the garments of light, real light that covered Adam and Eve, and the symbolic, or what that represents, is righteousness or obedience to God. Now we're told in Genesis that when Adam and Eve disobeyed God, they were left literally or physically naked. And the Bible tells us that it was because they were disobedient to God, or now they were unrighteous. In other words, their nakedness, literal nakedness, also represented symbolically spiritual nakedness, unrighteousness, or disobedience to God. So we notice then that originally there was the literal and the spiritual together in the Garden of Eden. A literal robe of light which represented spiritual righteousness. Then when man sinned, man was left literally naked, and the Bible tells us that that represented the fact that man was now unrighteous. Now the Bible tells us that God is going to resolve this problem of nakedness in two ways. You see, he has to resolve the problem of spiritual nakedness as well as literal nakedness. Now, the Bible tells us that the first thing that God fixes or repairs is by covering us with the spiritual robe of Christ's righteousness. In other words, it's the symbolic robe of Christ's righteousness. Notice Galatians chapter 3 and verse 26. Galatians 3 and verse 26, and we'll also read verse 27. It says here, "For you are all sons of God through faith in Christ Jesus. For as many of you as were baptized into Christ," notice, "have put on Christ." Obviously, we have not literally put on Christ. We don't have a literal robe of light. We have the spiritual robe, which represents the righteousness of Jesus Christ, symbolically speaking. However, God needs to restore man someday to the fullness of what he was in the Garden of Eden. And by the way, when I say man, I'm talking generically. It includes man and woman. But God has to restore not only the spiritual robe of Christ's righteousness by covering us spiritually, but someday the Bible tells us that he's also going to give us once again that literal robe of light. But that literal robe comes in the future. I want you to notice Revelation 7, 9 and 10, where it speaks about this moment. It says there, "After these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude which no one could number, of all nations, tribes, peoples, and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb." Now notice this, "clothed with white robes, with palm branches in their hands, and crying out with a loud voice, saying, Salvation belongs to our God, who sits on the throne, and to the Lamb." Notice that at this point, God's people are in heaven with Jesus. And the Bible tells us that they are clothed with white robes. Now these are literal white robes of light. So basically what Jesus does is now, in this period of human history, he covers us with the spiritual robes of Christ's righteousness. And of course, when Jesus comes again, he is going to give us an immortal body, and he is going to cover us with a literal robe of light, like the robe of light that covered Adam and Eve.